Hello and welcome to this Holy Week talk from the Diocese of Hallam. I'm Greg Ryan, I'm Director of Adult Formation for the Diocese, and I'm also a postdoctoral researcher in theology at the Centre for Catholic Studies up at Durham University. It's great to have a chance to share this talk online as part of the Cathedral's Holy Weeks talks, and also as part of the Diocesan Year of the Word programme, The God Who Speaks. We're looking at trying to deliver some more of the programme on Scripture this year online over the coming months, and I also look forward to when we can pick up where we left off and start our conversations again in person, hopefully not too far away in the future. As this is year A in the Church's liturgical cycle, the year in which the readings at Mass are drawn particularly from Matthew's Gospel, I've been asked to talk about what we know about Matthew and the kind of world in which his Gospel according to Matthew, was produced. This isn't necessarily straightforward. The Gospel, the one which appears first in Bibles today, is attributed to St. Matthew, one of the 12 apostles, and a tax collector or customs inspector. As we can see in this famous painting by Caravaggio of the call of Matthew, the light falling on him there as Jesus selects him. Now, tax collectors were generally treated with great disdain in Palestine at this time for two reasons. Firstly, they had a reputation for dishonesty, for helping themselves by charging people a little bit more than they really needed to collect. John the Baptist draws attention to this from time to time. Historians suggest that by the time of Jesus, this might have been somewhat undeserved under efficient Roman control and governance. However, that Roman control is precisely the problem. Tax collectors, even honest ones, were employed by the occupying power and willingly worked for them. They were publicans, to use the technical word, civil servants. Incidentally, if you know the song God and Man at Table are Sat Down, which has a line in it about repentant publicans are drawing near, this is what it means. It's talking about the tax collectors, not about landlords. And yet Jesus chooses one of these publicans, one of these tax collectors, called Levi in Mark and Luke, called Matthew in Matthew's Gospel, to be part of his core group, the 12, the refounding of the 12 tribes of Israel. It's beautifully captured in this painting, but perhaps equally well caught by the early English writer St. Bede of Jarrow, whose commentary on Matthew's calling had a profound effect on the spiritual life of a priest in Argentina, who would later become Pope Francis. This is his coat of arms. When he was ordained as bishop, he took as his motto this line from Bede's commentary on Matthew. Jesus not only sees Matthew in this description, but he sees by having mercy and by choosing all these things bound up together. And so he says to the tax collector, "Follow me." That theme of mercy is something I'm going to come back to, because it's not necessarily one that we immediately associate with Matthew's Gospel. Early church fathers record that Matthew wrote down the sayings of Jesus in the Hebrew language, or maybe the Aramaic language, or a Hebrew style. It can be interpreted in different ways. This was Papias writing very early on. And so the tradition emerged very quickly, and we find this in Jerome and in Origen and in Irenaeus, that Matthew had written his Gospel around the time of Peter's death as an eyewitness account and intended it for Jews who were becoming Christians. Certainly the Gospel as we have it has been known and quoted and respected by the early first century in the Didache, for example, a teaching document which is our earliest liturgical document. Despite this, consensus of scholars today would not consider the Gospel to have been written by the Apostle St. Matthew. Why is this? There's a couple of reasons. Firstly, the text we have, scholars have examined it and seen how it's composed, and it's clearly written in Greek. We have a Greek text today, but you can tell that it was written in Greek. It wasn't translated into Greek from another language, such as Aramaic or Hebrew, although we do find traces of Semitic influences, possible Aramaic formulations under some parts of the Gospel, like the Our Father. Secondly, if you look at the internal evidence within the Gospel, it seems to suggest a period in history after AD 70, after the fall of Jerusalem, after Jews are no longer worshipping at the temple, and Judaism is reinventing itself in what becomes the rabbinic model without the temple, based around the synagogues. And that's a traumatic time for all kinds of reasons, and doubly so for Jewish Christians. That's probably the context that we're seeing with Matthew. There are other clues as well. The structuring of the church suggests a relatively settled period of the church, not immediately after the time of Jesus. And the use of the Trinitarian formula in its most developed way in Matthew again points to a slightly later date. But most critically, the general consensus among scholars is that Matthew shows a dependency on Mark. Mark's Gospel is generally, not universally, thought to be the earliest Gospel that we now have. And 90% of it is reused in Matthew, who writes a much longer Gospel. Perhaps something of a commentary, an expanded homiletic commentary, taking the rather raw and direct Markan Gospel and filling it out, expanding it, putting a much longer introduction into the story of Jesus. Mark just starts straight away with John the Baptist. Matthew takes us back to the birth of Jesus. And particularly trying to re-emphasize some of the Jewish elements that have perhaps been obscured in Mark. If you look at the beginnings of these three Gospels, you can see the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Mark, Matthew, and Luke are all related. John deals with things rather differently. So this is from the beginning of their Gospels, when they're starting to talk about Jesus' ministry in Galilee. And you can see straight away here that Matthew has a great similarity with Mark, but has added in various details, most notably this big quotation from Isaiah, which he adds to show that the words spoken by the prophet might be fulfilled. And this is very typical of Matthew's style of writing, and it's something we'll come back to later on. So it looks like Matthew has created this homiletic commentary, possibly for teaching purposes within the church, possibly also to allow the Christian community, in a time of a rather difficult period of relationships with the Jewish community it's grown out of, to have something that they can use in apologetics in defence of their Christian perspective. The great biblical scholar Raymond Brown does sound a note of caution at this point, why he agrees that Mark is the earliest gospel and that Matthew has used Mark. He says we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss the evidence of the early fathers, particularly people like Papias, who's writing from talking to eyewitnesses within decades of these events happening, rather than our perspective 1900 years later. This diagram looks far more complicated than it really is. I'm trying to show some of the relationships between Mark, Matthew and Luke. Both Luke and Matthew use Mark. Luke and Matthew share some material, and Luke and Matthew each have their own specific detailed material. But I just wanted to show here really that if you look at the amount of Mark, 76% that is used by Mark, Luke and Matthew, plus the 18% that is used by Mark and Matthew alone, nearly 95% of Mark's Gospel is repurposed in Matthew. Conversely, over half of Matthew's Gospel is simply taken from Mark. Nonetheless, in recent years, biblical scholars have drawn attention to the fact that we don't just read historically. The fact that this particular Gospel, Matthew, was associated from the earliest times with Saint Matthew, the tax collector, might not just be because of that reference we see in Papias and others about the apostle writing down some of Jesus' sayings for the Hebrews. It might also be that the church instinctively recognizes that the themes of mercy, order, warning against hypocrisy, and the struggle for identity, which give this gospel its character, resonate dramatically, even if not historically, with the story of the publican apostle that Jesus saw through the eyes of mercy. So we're going to look at this gospel and Matthew's gospel in really three kind of main areas. One is to look at the text itself. I'm not going to go all the way through it, but I want to show the overview of it and pick out a couple of key features that might be of interest. Then I want to go back to this question of the relationship between the gospel writer and the Jewish community. Is Matthew writing for Jews? Is he a Jew? Is he maybe writing for Gentiles as well? So we can look at that. And then finally, just briefly touch on how Matthew treats the idea of church, which is something that he's got quite a unique perspective on amongst the evangelists. So if starting with Saint Matthew only gets us so far in understanding the context of this gospel, the text itself does rather more. So from this point onwards, except when I'm talking about that story of the call of the tax collector, if I say Matthew, I mean the author of the gospel, without any assumption that we really know who that was. Now Matthew is a gospel we're familiar with, even if we don't know it. And when I talk to people around the diocese, I often ask which are the parts of the gospel that particularly resonate, that they've loved or held on to. And it's often Luke's tales of mercy that come to the fore there. The Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the story of the good thief. This was also found when the Bible Society did some national research. They found that pattern is repeated nationally. I also get people talking a lot about passages from John's Gospel, which they've taken, perhaps not so much as stories, but they've taken into their prayer life and their spiritual life in a very deep way. In the beginning was the Word. I am the vine. God so loved the world that he sent his only Son. But despite all that, it's Matthew, which for centuries was the main text we'd have heard each week in church, in the lectionary, right up until the latter part of the 20th century. And it's Matthew which gives us the familiar words of the Our Father. It's a slightly different version in Luke. It gives us the best known version of the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. Again, Luke has a slightly truncated version and he sets it on a plane. All the Gospels show Jesus giving a special mission to Peter, but only Matthew has Jesus say to him, "You are Peter, and on this rock I shall build my church," and goes on to mention the keys to the kingdom of heaven. So if you look at the structure of the Gospel, this has been much commented on by scholars, that there's an opening section which talks about where Jesus comes from. There's a climatic section, largely common to all of the Gospels, although they all have their own individual approach to it, on the passion, the death, crucifixion, and resurrection. But in the middle, the Gospels are structured rather differently, and Matthew's structure is based around 5 large teaching discourses. It's 5 major pieces of Jesus' teaching, wrapped around with story, wrapped around with narrative. and he moves things that he's borrowed from Mark, or that he and Luke share, into different orders, so you can group them thematically to give these teaching blocks throughout the Gospel. From the earliest days, people have noted there are 5 of these, and perhaps there's a resonance there with the 5 books of the Torah, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. It's an attractive theory, or the problem with that is that the Passion gets relegated to a kind of appendix in that model. Nonetheless, there's a definite pattern of a large introduction, a large climactic section, and 5 blocks in the middle of teaching. And they point to the importance of teaching in this gospel, perhaps more than in any of the others. Not just at the time of Jesus, but at the time the gospel was being written, maybe 50 years later, and indeed still essentially for us today. The opening section, which would be well worth a talk in its own right, and I'm sure Father John Ryan could be convinced to do talks on this around Christmas time. The opening is often called the infancy narrative, as a parallel with Luke's account of Jesus' birth. Only Luke and Matthew have an account of Jesus' birth, and they both have the same kind of structure, but very different elements, very different details all the way through. Ian Boxall, great contemporary biblical scholar, has commented that they're not really infancy narratives. The actual birth of Jesus gets one sentence, and we don't see anything of Jesus as a child, as a young man, as we do in Luke, and as we do in some of the later apocryphal stories about Jesus as a young child. What's really going on here, perhaps, is explaining where Jesus comes from, who he's connected to. So Matthew spends a long time on the genealogy of Jesus, structuring it. This is one of Matthew's techniques. He structures it into 3 groups of 14 names, and telling the story of how Jesus, through Joseph, interestingly, can be traced back through the Davidic line. Interspersed among that genealogy are 5 women. And again, it's a subject that could be an entire talk in its own right. I'm sure you could go away and look at it, but that scholars debate what's the symbolism of the 5 women who are named. They all have some connection with being Gentiles themselves, or being married to a Gentile, so some kind of outsider connection. They all have some kind of scandal associated with the name, which is also true of Mary, who's the final one in this list. But there are a number of possible interpretations, and it may be that Matthew isn't just thinking of one possible symbolism here, and is actually quite cleverly layering symbol upon symbol. It seems to be something he does. Unlike Luke's Gospel, with the famous Annunciation to Mary, Matthew has an Annunciation to Joseph. It comes not through an angel directly, but through a dream. Dreams and angels are a repeating theme throughout the Gospel. As you probably know, it's not shepherds that visit in Matthew's account, but magi, portrayed in later legend as kings, drawing on an image from the Old Testament, sometimes translated now as wise men, but historically magi were astrologer priests in Persia. What's probably behind this imagery is the story of Balaam in Numbers 24, and a prophecy that a star shall come forth out of Jacob. By the 1st century, when time of Jesus, some Jewish groups at least interpreted that prophecy as foretelling the Messiah. And Balaam, who's involved in this story, is described in the Greek translations of the Bible as a magus, the singular of magi. But even more so, behind this story is a sympathetic resonance with the story of Moses. In Matthew's account, Jesus, like Moses, has to be hidden from a vengeful ruler, King Herod, Pharaoh in the Moses story, who wants to kill all the male children. Moses becomes famous for leading the people out of Egypt. In Matthew's story, of course, Jesus escapes into Egypt. And on an even wider scale, again sticking with that story of the Exodus, it's not just Moses but the whole people who cross through the water into the promised land. And what happens next in the story about Jesus after these infancy narratives, we get into the stories of Jesus' baptism going through water, followed by the temptations in the desert. So he moves through water to the wilderness, reversing the direction of Moses. I said earlier that one of the main themes that we see, these big 5 discourses that run through, is this theme of Jesus as teacher. Often this teaching takes place on a mountain, echoes, of course, of Moses there receiving the 10 Commandments, but also Zion, the mountain on the good news in Isaiah 49, and the mountain of the king in Psalm number 2. Despite the parallels with Moses, Jesus is clearly presented in Matthew as more than Moses, greater than Moses. We see the same pattern in the letter to the Hebrews, possibly written around the same time. So, for example, when Moses receives the commands from the Lord on Mount Sinai, Moses says, "The Lord commands." He passes on the message. When Jesus is giving the Sermon on the Mount, he simply says, "I say to you." He claims that divine imperative to be able to speak directly on behalf of God. Ian Boxall, going back to Ian Boxall's work, has pointed out something of an anomaly here, that given these teaching discourses, which make such a big part of the Gospel, and the assumed use of Matthew as a teaching text in the early church, one might expect to see the title teacher being given to Jesus, along with more familiar terms like Messiah and Son of God. In fact, every time Jesus is addressed as didaskalos, a teacher, in Matthew's Gospel, it's by his enemies. Put the references at the bottom of this slide. He is, however, once, or by one person, addressed as rabbi by one of the 12. A rabbi is a form of teacher that's an honorific form for a religious teacher, someone greatly respected. But there again, the only person who's allowed to put, say, a rabbi to Jesus is Judas. So there's clearly a text going on, a subtext going on in Matthew here, that Jesus is more than the teacher, more than Moses, more than a rabbi. Similarly, perhaps even more strongly, there's an injunction that the disciples themselves are never to be called rabbi. This probably indicates a situation after 70 AD where rabbi has become used not just as a mark of respect for a religious teacher, but a specific name for the leader of a synagogue. And Jesus rebukes them beautifully in the one translation, I think in the NRSV, says, "You have one teacher and you're all still students." So what do the disciples call Jesus? Well, they call him Lord. In the light of Jesus as the true teacher, and more than Moses, the disciples recognize him as Kyrios, as the Lord. And not only teacher, but also judge. Again, a very strong theme throughout Matthew's Gospel. The phrase, the day of judgment, crops up over and over again, along with that beautiful characteristic Matthean phrase, "There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth," which is repeated as a motif throughout the Gospel. But what's often missed when we hear those phrases in Matthew is the emphasis on mercy. as I illustrated at the start, talking about the call of the Apostle Matthew, the tax collector. We can see this particularly, perhaps, in the miracles, in comparing the miracles and the parables, which are added in when you compare Matthew and Mark. So not only are the additional healing miracles added in to Matthew, again emphasizing Jesus' mercy and how Jesus is deeply moved towards mercy in these healings, but Matthew adds in a number of additional parables. Some of these are fairly typical parables about the kingdom. It's a pearl of great price, it's a hidden treasure. But particularly interesting are these three at the bottom. This parable of the two sons, or the unmerciful servant, or the labourers in the vineyard. So to take the labourers in the vineyard, for example, where the people who've just worked for an hour get paid the same as those who've worked in the heat of the day all day. This illustrates that overflowing abundance of God, so great that Jesus can call the hated tax collector to be one of his apostles. In the unmerciful servant, the parable here, we see the themes of judgment and mercy intertwined. Yes, there's a terrible judgment on the servant at the end. He's cast back into prison. But it becomes because he's had mercy shown to him and he doesn't show it to others. This theme of being warning against hypocrisy, warning against abuse of power, particularly religious power, is a very strong theme throughout Matthew. As Ian Boxall again correctly notes, in the parable of the sheep and goats, which comes at the end of Matthew's Gospel in chapter 25, it's very clear that the church stands under Christ's judgment just as much as the rest of the world does. In the story of the two sons, the parable itself is interesting, but what's most interesting is the commentary at the end of it. This is the story that appearances can be deceptive. One son says, I will go, and doesn't go. The other says, I won't go, but then does go. But the commentary at the end interprets this and says, the tax collectors and prostitutes are entering the kingdom before you. So the tax collectors brought to the fore then the people you would least likely to expect, not the Pharisees, not the church leaders. Scholars have noted something of a rabbinic style in Matthew's parables. They're indicative rather than imperative. They make suggestions rather than giving straightforward instructions. They use vibrant characters, but often fulfilling something of a two-dimensional role. And Matthew also tends to break down the parables and interpret them as allegories, where each part of them represents one specific thing in the real world. And having looked in the first part at the background and structure to the writing of the gospel, I want to move on in the second half to think about the community context in which it's being written and to whom it's being addressed, by looking at two things. One, the relationship of Matthew's gospel to the Jewish community, and secondly, how Matthew deals with the idea of church. I already mentioned in the first part of this talk a very early tradition that Matthew was writing in the Hebrew language or in a Hebrew or Aramaic style. And a number of commentators in the early church read that as being intended for Jewish converts. Now certainly there's a lot of Jewish stuff going on in this gospel. Quotations from the Old Testament, both from the Greek version, the Septuagint, and from the standard Hebrew text, plus a number of unknown translations which might be the author's own translations or translations from memory, or from copies of translations that we simply no longer have to study. 17 of these quotations from the prophets come up in the gospel, including one vague reference to the prophets which can't be traced. Of these, Isaiah comes up 7 times, the prophet who seems to have such a special place in the early church, not least because of all of his image about the suffering servant, which seems to apply so well to Jesus. Sometimes Isaiah is called the fifth evangelist because he fits so well and is used so heavily by the early Christian communities. But also lines like Hosea 6:6, which comes up a couple of times in Matthew, a favourite text. Go and learn that I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And that theme of mercy running through. And Jeremiah, we've already mentioned, quoted at the beginning and the end of the Gospel. And there are consistent echoes of Moses all the way through. Now, several times Matthew makes some very free interpretations on these texts, which might surprise us. For example, his comment on a prophecy from Micah about Bethlehem. In Matthew says Bethlehem is not least among the tribes of Judah. But in Micah, the opposite point is being made. Bethlehem is one of the little clans of Judah. The most complex example of this is perhaps a striking phrase in chapter 2, verse 23. He shall be called a Nazarene. Now this, despite it saying is from the prophets, isn't taken from any of the canonical books of the Hebrew Bible. And instead it seems to be quite a complex, multi-layered wordplay on the town Jesus comes from, Nazareth. The Hebrew word netzah, branch, referring to the idea of Jesus coming from the stock of Jesse, from part of that same, what we now call the Jesse tree. And also the word nazir, consecrated and holy, as in a Nazarite vow, which Paul takes shortly before returning to Jerusalem. This should alert us to the fact that the author of this gospel is perfectly capable of telling a story on many levels, something we might be more familiar with in John's gospel, but by no means absent in Matthew. There are other clues about the Jewishness of this gospel. Unlike Mark and Luke, Matthew speaks not of the kingdom of God, but the kingdom of heaven, or perhaps of the heavens, alluding to God without saying the divine name, a very Jewish style of speech. His storytelling is deeply immersed in the world of Jewish apocalyptic too, with angels and demons playing roles as concretely as human characters, and as we've said, with the notion of judgment never far from the horizon. More down-to-earth evidence for the Jewish context of the gospel can be seen in little details that can sometimes simply taken for granted by the writer, needing no explanation on the part of the author or his assumed readers. Jesus instructs his followers, for example, about modesty in the length of the tassels on their prayer shawls, the assumption being that they are wearing prayer shawls, as a good Jewish man would. And this setting is very clear in Matthew's version of the controversy over working on the Sabbath. In Mark and Luke, this appears much more as a straightforward confrontation. Man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man. In Matthew, however, the dialogue is couched much more in terms of a careful rabbinic argument, carefully avoiding any suggestion that the law has been overturned in any way. Nonetheless, the relationship of the gospel to particular Jewish groups is interesting. It's extremely critical of the Pharisees, and often with them the Sadducees and sometimes the scribes, although scribes come in for less criticism than we see in, for example, in Mark. Together with references to scribes assumed to be in the Matthean community in the church, the early church, this has led some to suggest that the author, if it wasn't the tax collector of Jesus' time, but somebody a little later, might have been a first century Jewish Christian scribe who's had a difficult relation with the Pharisees. Around about AD 70, with the fall of Jerusalem, shortly after that, there's a famous gathering. It may not have been a single event and possibly spread over a period of time, but over time and associated with the coastal town of Jamnia, the Jewish religion restructures itself out of the ashes of Jerusalem and starts to build itself around the synagogues. Now, as part of that restructuring, it becomes very defensive of its identity and issues a number of curses, excommunications really, cutting off fellowship with certain types of people. And amongst those are the Nazarenes, followers of Jesus of Nazareth. So it's likely that Matthew's Gospel is being written in that context. A Jewish Christian community, as Jesus was, of course, himself and all the apostles, but who are now in a very strained relationship with at least some aspects of Judaism around 70, 80 AD. You can see that, as I've put on this slide, for example, in the references to their synagogues. At least some synagogues are places where Christians will be abused, driven out, beaten, whipped, flogged. But perhaps most importantly, we need to consider what the relationship of Jesus is to the law. In chapter 5, verse 17, part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says firmly, "I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." So how does this fit with what we hear in the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, which have been called the Matthean antitheses, the contradictions, which follow a standard form of, "You have heard it said," and then Jesus will quote from the law, "But I say to you," and he'll give a new interpretation. Now, scholars have noted that although the rhetorical form is this contrasting, "You have heard, but I say," what's actually being proposed here is not a rejection or a reversal, but more about going beyond, doing more than the law requires. It's being described as hypertheses, more than what the law says. Some of the instructions Jesus gives in the Sermon on the Mount could be interpreted as the common Pharisaic practice of putting a hedge around the law, raising the bar of what's allowed even higher, something harder to strive for, to avoid accidentally breaking the law. So, for example, the law forbids murder, which arises from anger. So having a new law that says don't even get angry, whilst it might be good in its own right, its purpose may be primarily to stop you breaking the existing law of the fifth commandment. You don't even get near that dangerous law-breaking stage of killing. But there is almost certainly more to it than that. When we hear Jesus say that he has come to fulfill the law, we can easily miss the significance of these words if we don't stop and think about them a little more deeply. When we talk in English about fulfilling an obligation, it sounds like a duty, as if Jesus has simply come to tick off the boxes on the law imposed by a perhaps vengeful God. And quite apart from the flawed and dangerous theology that would be at work in that idea, it misses what this word fulfill really means. Even in English, the meaning is right there in front of us. To fill fully, to fill to the utmost, literally to fulfill. Not simply to do the minimum required, but to have God's gift in all of its fullness and all of its rich dimensions. This Greek word for fulfillment, plerou, Matthew uses 16 times, 12 of which are in relation to the scriptures. It can mean a fuller understanding of the prophets. For example, when he interprets the words about the virgin birth. It can also mean that Jesus performs the law more fully than the teachers of the law were doing, especially the Pharisees. The emphasis there being on what Jesus does more perfectly than anyone else acts. However, in the Sermon on the Mount and elsewhere in Matthew, this fuller understanding of the law also seems to be directed towards the disciples. You see this in chapter 5, chapter 21, 22 as well. And it seems like almost an impossible ideal. But these two understandings of fulfillment, I think, start to come together here. Jesus has perfectly modelled what fully following the law of God looks like. He does it perfectly. But he's also taught us, as the great teacher and more than a teacher, what to aim for, even if in that there's a degree of hedging around the law for most of us in reality, in the sense that we can rarely, if ever, live up to the demands of the Beatitudes and Sermon on the Mount. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian martyred by the Nazis in the Second World War, shows a deep appreciation of what he would call the cost of discipleship involved in the Beatitudes. He says the Sermon on the Mount is not a word to be treated lightly. Its validity depends on its being obeyed. This is not a word to be freely evaluated, not a word you can take or leave. It is a compelling, dominating word. Just want to go back to one point about Gentiles before we carry on. Said that there's lots of evidence for the Jewishness of the gospel, and indeed most of the references, many references to the Gentiles, are clearly still considered to be very much the other in relation to the Matthean community, as we see in chapter 6 verse 7, chapter 10 verse 5, and chapter 18 verse 17, for example. But Matthew is probably he's writing in Greek for Greek-speaking Jewish practitioners. So probably not in Jerusalem, probably not in Palestine. We're probably looking in Asia Minor or North Africa. But the most likely place for Matthew's Gospel to have been written for the communities he's addressing is Syria and quite possibly Antioch. Matthew's Gospel seems to be known about first in Syria. Bits of it are picked up and used in Syrian texts. Antioch, we know from other sources, for example Galatians, that there's a Jewish and a Gentile community there, and there's some tension between them, at least in Paul's day. There are little clues. The Syrophoenician woman in Matthew's account is described as a Canaanite woman. That's a local word that would have been used in Syria. But also Antioch, which is one of the major cities. It's interesting that Matthew, when talking about the towns and in the parables, rarely talks about villages or towns. He talks about cities all the time. The Greek word he uses is the word for cities. So we're probably a city-based Syrian setting with Jews and Gentiles, and Antioch is as good a likelihood as any. So finally, I just want to say a few things about Matthew's idea of church. Although this Greek word ecclesia, word for church, crops up regularly in the Pauline letters, it only occurs in one of the Gospels, and that's Matthew. It has both a secular meaning behind it, just meaning assembly, and a religious one. In the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, ecclesia is a word used to translate Kahal Yahweh, the assembly of the Lord. It has a deep significance in a religious context as well, in Matthew's usage here and in Paul's usage throughout his letters. And most famously, the word appears in Matthew 16:18 after Peter confesses Jesus as the Messiah, and only in Matthew's account Jesus replies, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Put the whole text up there on the screen. Although this might seem straightforward, especially when read from a Catholic context, it actually raises all kinds of interesting questions. What the rock is, for example. The obvious answer is that it's Peter who's going to prove to be a rock for the early church, as Luke tells us in Acts at Pentecost, starting at Pentecost and going right through to his martyrdom. Nevertheless, even in antiquity, Origen in the 3rd century read Peter here as an archetype for all Christians rather than being something special about Peter himself. And the Eastern Orthodox traditions often understand the rock to be faith in Christ. And some Protestant scholars after the Reformation suggested indeed that the rock is Christ, not unreasonably drawing on Paul, who says precisely that in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 4. Nonetheless, on the basis of the portrayal of Peter in all four Gospels and the evidence of the rest of the New Testament, I think we can securely see Simon, renamed Peter, now Rocky, by Jesus, to be recognised as having a special role. That role is emphasised by the keys to the kingdom of the heavens, by the power of binding and loosing. Again, it's easy to read this through the eyes of later developments in the Western Church, but in its original context there's a couple of things to say. The gift of the keys is an image, again from Isaiah, from chapter 22 of Isaiah. A prophecy regarding the replacement of Shebna by Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, as steward of the royal household in Jerusalem. So one leader, one trusted person being replaced because he's abused his power in that story by a new one. I think that's the theme going behind this. Peter therefore appears to be put in charge not so much in terms of absolute power as delegated administration, including administration of the law. He's been described as the chief rabbi in Matthew's understanding of church. And just as Abraham changed his name from Abraham and became father of the Jewish people, so Simon is having his name changed to Peter and becoming the rock-like, Abraham-like figure for the church in this time of turmoil for Christians and Jews. The keys are linked with the power of binding and loosing, a common rabbinic idea from the time, so they're able to give authentic interpretations, although that same power is given to the disciples as a group just a little later on. But Matthew, true to his focus on mercy and also his careful eye for hypocrisy, immediately connects this power with a true understanding of the nature of the Messiah. And we see that also in Mark. But to underline it in Matthew's account, after the rebuke, "Get behind me, Satan," or Matthew's addition is Jesus saying to Peter, "You have become a scandalon," literally a stumbling stone. So Peter is a rock, yes, but in this case a rock that people trip over. Now, taken together with the criticism of the Pharisees throughout the Gospel, for example, placing burdens on people and not offering to help them, in contrast to Jesus, who has a yoke that is easy and a burden light, and the emphasis from Hosea on desiring mercy, not sacrifice, Matthew offers a challenging critique of what leadership and service looks like in the church that's as relevant today as it was in the 1st century AD. Indeed, in Matthew's writing on the church, scholars have noticed what Ulrich Luth calls transparency between the narrative time, when the story is set with Jesus on earth, to the time of the writer, Matthew's community, maybe some 50 years later. Accounts of Jesus' life in the Gospels, in Matthew's Gospel, are written in a way that points towards the ongoing community life in the early church. For example, regarding liturgical prayer in chapter 6, baptism and the Eucharist in chapter 26, church order and excommunication in chapter 18, and mention of Christian scribes, wandering prophets, and also community-based prophets. This transparency continues not only until the time of Matthew's community, but right through until the church today, shaping our lives as Christian disciples. The Our Father, the Beatitudes, the role of Peter, and not least the instructions Jesus gives his disciples, and by implication us as well, in the closing chapters of Matthew's Gospel. In Matthew 25, we have the parable of the sheep and goats, which underscores the warning against hypocrites and abuses of power. This parable is sometimes overshadowed by the chapters at the very end, in fact in chapter 28, the very last verses of the Gospel, the so-called Great Commission. Go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teach them to observe everything I have commanded you. But actually, the parable of the sheep and goats and that Great Commission are both part of the same concern for the Church's mission, proclamation of the Gospel on one hand and liberating service on the other hand, themes that we see throughout the writings of the modern popes. This commission concludes Matthew's Gospel by bringing it back to the beginning. Jesus, introduced as son of Abraham in chapter 1, the Abraham whose descendants will be countless as grain of sands on the shore, that same Jesus now commands the disciples to go out to the whole world. This technique of placing chunks of text between two related themes, one used by several of the Gospel writers, it's called an inclusio, including something in between, a bookending technique. And Ian Boxall rightly describes Matthew's greatest inclusio as this conclusion to the Gospel. He contrasts it to Mark, Luke and John, saying, at the end of this Gospel of Matthew, where one might expect the risen Jesus to go ahead, as in Mark 16, or to ascend, as in Luke 24 and John 20, Matthew presents Jesus as the one who stays. Matthew's risen Son of Man is the abiding divine presence, the Shekinah, with you always to the end of the age. Here we find the Gospel's last and greatest inclusio, taking the reader back to the beginning and the first prophecy quoted from Isaiah. And they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us.